in the show. Although Brookside's Gordon Collins appeared in 1982, he did not come out as a gay man until 1985. Unlike Lynn Carson, Gordon Collins had a romantic interest, Chris Duncan. It is important to note that Gordon and Chris's relationship has been one of the most impactful soap stories for queer soap opera history. In 1988, the Collins house was attacked by the queer bashers, and they graffitied their garage door and left a message, and quote, "If AIDS don't get you, we will, and shirtlifters live here," end quote. And this particular storyline engaged with the homophobic tendencies in 1980s British society. Moreover, this story made a clear connection between the homophobic tendencies and the AIDS epidemic. Since the politicians at the time were fueling the fears, these backlashes and attacks were common in queer communities. During the second half of the 1980s, EastEnders featured several gay characters and lesbian characters. Although these characters are instrumental for representation of queers in soap operas, all of these characters short-lived, and they were not major characters. Unlike their British counterparts, American soap operas were more conservative and very reluctant to include queer characters. The second significant queer character, Hank Elliott, appeared in 1982 and exited as the world turns canvas in 1989. The low number of LGBTQ characters in soap operas indicated that the British and American television industries were reluctant to challenge the social and cultural stigmas about the queer individuals. Hence, they only included short-lived minor characters. During the late 1980s and the early 1990s, soap operas in the US and Britain began addressing the AIDS epidemic and cultural stigmatization of sick queer bodies. EastEnders' Joe Wallace appeared in 1991 as an HIV-positive character. Joe is a significantly important who calls attention to queer sick bodies and the negative social and cultural norms and expectations attached to these bodies. Besides Joe Wallace's story, unlike films of the 1990s, the queer representations were highly linked to the AIDS epidemic. Although most of the queer characters of the 1980s were men, the majority of the queer characters during the 1990s in British soap operas were lesbians. While most of the earlier characters appeared in Brookside and EastEnders, Coronation Street and Emmerdale began featuring LGBTQA characters. Della Alexander debuted as the first lesbian character in EastEnders, excuse me, and the character departed in 1996. A number of other short-lived lesbian characters appeared in EastEnders. Although these characters are important for queer soap opera history, it was Emmerdale's Zoe Tate who provided the most iconic lesbian character of the 1990s. The widely popular character perhaps was early sign of the changing British culture when it came to the queer lives and the more liberal turn in the British politics. When the Labour's Party's Tony Blair became the Prime Minister in 1997, Emmerdale's Zoe Tate was already changing the life in a small Yorkshire village. She came out as a lesbian in 1993, and she began her relationship with Emma Nightingale soon after. The couple had a commitment ceremony in 1996, way before the Civil Partnership Act. During the third term of the Tony Blair's Labour government, the Civil Partnership Act of 2004 came to in effect in December 2005, making the UK one of the few countries that provided certain civil rights to queer individuals. On the other hand, unlike the British soap operas, American soaps during the 1990s refused to engage with queer lives. Only 4 queer characters appeared in the 1990s. They were all minor characters and quickly written out. One Life to Live's Billy Douglas story is the only one that captured wider attention. Billy Douglas's story was about homophobia and coming out. Despite more liberal political atmosphere in the US, the Clinton years, the lack of queer characters in soap operas indicated that the mainstream American culture was not ready to watch the stories of queer characters and meaningfully engage with queer lives. Although Billy Douglas's story was significant, he was a very short-lived character. As the 1990s ended, American soap operas remained very white, middle class, and upper class, and very heterosexual. Although there were more queer visibilities in the British and American soap operas, most of these characters were cisgendered lesbian women during the 1990s. In 1998, Coronation Street introduced popular and widely acclaimed Hayley Cooper was one of the show's very transgender character. While the character provided a multi-layered and dimensional transgender character, she also embodied the more progressive queer politics of the late 1990s and the early 2000s of the British society. The absence of the established characters was striking. Besides, EastEnders' Tony Hills and Simon Raymond and Emmerdale's Jason Kirk were the only long-term characters. The invisibility of the gay characters in British and American soap operas could easily be linked to the AIDS epidemic and cultural stigmas attached to the gay and diseased bodies. As many queer media scholars already argued, it was easier for the mainstream audience to envision two women having sex than thinking about two men having sex. Without a doubt, these political and cultural realities and the tendencies of these times negatively impacted queer history of British and American soap operas. While the 2000s presented more queer characters in soap operas and provided some challenges for the genre, at least in the US context. In the US, despite the conservative turn of the Bush era and the fear culture of the post 9/11, more queer characters began to appear. Some of the most popular, beloved American soap operas, such as All My Children, As the World Turns, and One Life to Live, began featuring more prominent queer characters. All My Children was leading by pack by making the shows one of the most memorable characters, Erica Kane's daughter Bianca Montgomery, as the first lesbian character. With her queerness was written into the family structure. Of course, her early stories were about coming out, family's reaction to her lesbianism, her sexual assault, and other usual soapy stories. As time progressed, Bianca was paired with other lesbian characters, and she featured in the first lesbian kiss in American soap history. This delayed milestone might not be important for British audience who was exposed to more lesbian characters in queer storylines. Bianca's story was significant for American audience. She quickly became a queer icon in the US despite the conservative Bush era. While All My Children focused on Bianca's adventures, As the World Turns introduced a regular gay character, Luke Snyder, in the mid-2000s, and the queer politics began to focus on issues such as gay marriage. Until 2000s, a significant portion of the media coverage about gay men had been about AIDS epidemic, and their lives were defined by the politics around it. Television shows like Will and Grace, films like My Best Friend's Wedding, and others began charting new territory for representation of gay men in media and film. Soap operas decided their conservative outlook in the US and began following this trend. Hence, Luke Snyder became the very first long-term gay character who also had not one but two romantic interests. Luke and Noah quickly became shows one of the most popular couples and elevated them into a super couple status with a very large fan base, including in the Netherlands. Similarly, One Life to Live included two gay characters in the late 2000s, and these characters were not isolated incidents. They were signaling the changing nature of the US politics and more liberally leaning millennial generation. Therefore, in some ways, they were embodying the political excitement of the Obama era and serving as the early signs of the queer acceptance with reservations. While American soap operas were in shaky grounds, British soap operas were still popular in the UK. The arrival of more youth-oriented Channel 5 soap opera in 1995, Hollyoaks, provided several queer characters throughout 2000s. As the show's popularity raised among the young audience, the creative team of the show continued to interweave multidimensional queer characters from different backgrounds. In some ways, the show was embodying multicultural UK of the time under the Labour government. Hollyoake was not the only British soap opera that successfully introduced strong and complex queer characters. Coronation Street has focused on the long-term Todd Grisham. Its coming out story introduced Chantal in 2006. Another long-term character was born and grew up in the show. Sophie Webster came out in 2010. Although EastEnders has included several queer characters, none of them were long-term. This trend somewhat continued until the late 2000s. The show introduced Christian Clark in 2008 and Saeed Masood, British Pakistani gay man. While the show successfully paired these two characters, EastEnders was also presented one of the most complicated gay character via Saeed Masood. Through his story, the show dealt with Muslim queer lives and aspects of diasporic queer realities when the religion, societal, and cultural expectations clash, and immigrant lives are struck in the middle of complex and layered international cultural politics. To note, through the Masood family, the show also further explored the complexities of diasporic communities and different intersections within. In 2008, Emmerdale introduced one of its beloved characters, Aaron Livesey. Aaron was a complex story. As a self-loathing homosexual, the audience witnesses dark side of the human psychology when one is in denial and self-loathing. The 2000s was a complicated decade for both American and British societies. Both countries experienced sharp political and cultural divisions and rise of ultra-right nationalistic fascistic movements and politics. These divisions resulted with the Brexit vote in the UK and the election of Trump in the US. However, right before these key points, the same-sex marriage was legalized in both countries. All of these complicated political and cultural shifts was also impacted the media representation of queer community. In the US, Days of Our Lives focused on Will Horton and Soni Kyriakis' romance, making them one of the most popular couples of the show. The show clearly struggled with the Trump-era politics, and the couple was written out in September 22, right before November 22 presidential election. The reasons of the departure of the characters are debatable, but the timing clearly indicates some of the types of cultural fear. Since the characters made brief appearances, however, at the end of 2010, General Hospital's gay characters were sidelined and only had brief appearances without being part of any major storyline. The Bold and the Beautiful's transgender characters vanished. However, The Young and the Restless successfully launched a lesbian character despite the Trump era. And let me conclude by saying that I argue in this presentation, in this larger project, although there is more queer visibility in British soaps, the shows are still tackling social and cultural challenges, such as nationalistic and conservative politics that still dominates both the UK and the US political and cultural landscape. There's a clear link between politics and representation of queer characters, and this is extremely visible in soap operas, just like the representation of Black and brown bodies. More than any other groups, racial and queer communities individuals are deeply affected by the conservative political bent, since race and sexuality are often serves as ways to divide people and their political interests. And thank you. I will stop sharing.
Your love, that was great. Krishan? You're on mute.
Okay. Oh, that's hard to follow. Beautiful, Ahmet. Beautiful. Okay, bear with me. I'm just going to share my screen. So I think it's worth mentioning, similar to Ahmet, this is a working paper at the moment. I've currently just got round to completing my field work for this paper, and essentially I'm in the process right now of kind of analysing my responses from participants. Okay. This is also the first time I've ever presented, so please do forgive me if I seem a little nervous or go to that glass of water a little bit too much. So
You're fine. You're doing fine. You're doing great.
So, my current working title for this paper is The Violence of Invisibility in Queer Ethnic Representation in UK Feel-Good Television. And to give you a little bit of background around why I'd taken up this project, I read a poll, a YouGov poll in 2022, which essentially argued that the British public made up of around, I believe, 1,000 people who participated in the survey felt that 45% of them felt that ethnic minorities were overrepresented on screen, whereas those who essentially felt that these bodies were underrepresented was around 26%. And there was a very similar parallel to what the survey data brought up around LGBTQIA plus characters. 44% of those participants felt that these groups were overrepresented, whereas around 25% felt that they were underrepresented. As it is a YouGov poll produced in 2022, this is the only data that was produced. This is all we essentially know from this subset of 1,000 people. And I found it quite interesting how the British population that they inputted into the survey had quite similar viewpoints, or felt that level of overrepresentation for both those groups was very similar. I wanted to see what that looked like in comparison to essentially the general population in the UK, and see if there was kind of any connection between people's views of representation on screen and kind of the realities of those people consuming the content. So I'm going to bring up these bits of data that I managed to glean from the ONS 2021 survey, and not picking on the BBC as it were, but they were the only production house that I could find data for, looking at their equality data for their on-screen populace. And what I found was quite, to my mind, was quite interesting. So I'd found by comparing the data sets was essentially that the on-screen populations of ethnically diverse characters was in a lot of cases more so than the population within the UK. Sorry, I say UK, England and Wales. So what we found was that black characters were represented almost a third more than the actual population within the UK. So whereas Asian groups were hugely underrepresented compared to the general populace, and this was very similar to what we found with LG. Well, in this case, for the BBC, the data set that they had, it was gay, lesbian, and bisexual characters, whereas they were represented on screen twice as much as in the general population within the UK. I keep saying UK, England and Wales, and actual trans characters were very minimal between what was broadcasted on the BBC, and this was produced in around 2019. So I found it quite interesting how essentially through the prior mentioned survey, there was people felt that these characters were overrepresented, and in some cases, particularly with black characters and gay, lesbian, and bisexual characters, they were represented on screen compared to the general population. And I thought I would try to kind of problematize that further by I'll mention a little bit, having a look at these TV shows with a large participant base and really see what their viewpoints on them were. Explain a little bit about why I felt that it was important to look at this area and look at the representation of queer ethnic characters in more detail. As we know, being in this conference today, television is a powerful tool. As Costello says, television fiction is one of the most powerful mechanisms for inventing national culture, because of the banal and routine way in which this is portrayed. Similarly, Robert Dyer talks about visual representation serving as a mirror in which we can see ourselves within dominant discourse, and it reflects back to us in ways which are seen and understood by others, and it also positions us within a particular power relation. I won't go through all of these for time's sake, but essentially, for me, taking on this project, was important because, as Chadha says in 2018, it's needed to understand how the country and its society and its people are represented in media that's produced it. Otherwise, how can we relate to people in reality? Some of the key concepts that I've relied on within my fieldwork, and which I probably should have changed the order and spoken that about a little bit before the slide, but some of the key theories that I've relied on while I was undertaking my fieldwork was Sarah Ahmed's idea of effect when we watch films, and how effect are these sticky things that mark up boundaries and create differences in viewing. It's also used to exclude as well as include people within the kind of wider conversation. Another person who's quite important to both the fieldwork aspect and some of the early findings that's coming out is Michelle Friedner, who looks at disability representation in the Indian context. Friedner talks about how any kind of intersectionality is obscured in the way that is engineered on screen, where it's a top-down approach to representation. And in a lot of ways, a lot of those intersectional and marginalized identities are there on screen for a feel-good diversity aspect. And this form of feel-good diversity, as Friedner positions, collapses the gaps between the public and the private spheres, creating a space in which corporate interests can seemingly intersect with those of a national message. However, due to this feel-good representation and diversity that we see on screen for those actual bodies, based on how the representation comes across, there's a lingering feeling in the background of a negative affect, feelings of disgust, shame, and fear, because of the overrepresentation of these bodies and characters on screen. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the methods that I took on within this project to really find out what the queer ethnic community within Newham, where my project is based, felt about these representations on screen, and how it's kind of impacted their realities off screen. So as part of a film club project that I'm running currently for my doctoral studies, which is mainly around disability inclusion, but for this this particular project, we screened a few episodes from 3 films with 17 queer ethnic individuals at differing ages and genders within the borough of Newham. We watched episodes together and collectively analysed the random assortment of episodes that we played from these 3 shows: Banana, Ackley Bridge, and Sex Education. At the end of the screenings, we would come together as a small focus group and discuss our perspectives of the queer ethnic characters and how they were portrayed. From that point, through our focus group, we identified key themes and categorized them into set themes that the participants felt as they were watching the shows. Once we brought together those themes, we came back as a group for one last focus group to discuss those themes in more detail and to discuss how it affects their advocacy, their avail of rights in the UK, and essentially how they position themselves in society from seeing these characters on screen and how it makes them feel. So I do apologize. If anybody is interested to know what episodes of the TV shows we watched, they're here on screen. So we watched Banana, which came out in 2015. We watched the first 2 episodes. They showcased 2 characters, one called Scotty and one called Dean. I should have been more due diligent like Ahmet was and put some pictures up. But within Ackley Bridge, which came out in 2017, we watched the 8th episode of season 3. The 4th season, we watched episode 3 and episode 10 of season 5. And with Sex Education, we looked at the 2 characters, Eric and Ola. They came out of season 3, episode 6 and season 3, episode 7. So after watching these after watching these shows and coming together as a group, we had a look at them. We started investigating the themes that were coming out from the discussions, and most of the participants felt that the portrayals of these characters were either overtly negative, inaccurate, or in some cases discriminatory. They felt that these queer ethnic characters were almost homogenized. There was a template in which these characters were being seen on screen. And on top of that as well, they felt that many of the representations of these bodies were over-sexualized. The way that after watching the shows and really thinking about how these characters were portrayed on screen, most of the participants felt that their self-esteem was it impacted their self-esteem, feeling isolated through not being truly understood through their representation on screen, and how consumption of this content over the series of the episodes really started to get them to internalize their position as internalize how they were positioned on screen. So kind of taking on the narrative of what they're seeing on screen as opposed to their true identities and kind of lived experiences. And from that point, and I'm early days at the moment in analyzing kind of all the transcripts that came out of our meetings and discussions. So what I've done is I've synthesized a few of the quotes participants fed through within the project, and they all correlate to the wider themes that we identified at the beginning. And I'll read a few out to you, if that's okay. So, and this is one of the quotes from a Somali female participant, relatively young, age of 19. All of these participants are Newham residents. So without putting in the swear that they did, this participant MA felt that all of these portrayals within the TV shows and episodes that we watched were, similar stereotypes. They spoke about how it was so rare to see shows pull away from the stereotypes that were being positioned within these TV episodes. This is an interesting one from participant who I've acronized to WU. It said, "No wonder cis white people have had enough of seeing their bodies on screen when all they do is take their their clothes off." Kind of drawing back to this feeling of the participants that they were over-sexualized within these shows. And imagine for that participant, that wasn't their lived experience of being a Pakistani queer male within his 30s. He essentially couldn't reconcile with the idea that this is what other people are seeing about people who look like him. Another quote here, notice how they betray us, and in this context, Black gay men, as either poor, uneducated, happy-go-lucky characters who are in negative situations. And further, I'll read off the last two quotes very quickly. TV, and this kind of draws back to when we had our early focus groups and we're talking about the importance of these representations. KK says that TV is meant to be a mirror of society, but I've yet to meet anyone who acts like these characters in real life. And finally, AO mentions that this is why we have the politics we have right now in this country. Those in power see us only on TV through these portrayals, and this informs how they think of us. I skipped a slide. No, I haven't. Okay. I could have done better putting these in bullet points. As I mentioned earlier, I'm currently still going through all of the data and kind of collating it all. But some of the early conclusions that I've drawn out from the transcripts that I have gone through and kind of organized was that out of the 17 new residents who participated in the project, who cited their interpretations of how these shows were, cited how their interpretations of these shows was overtly negative. Though they initially celebrated their inclusion within these TV shows, they felt that such portrayals were overly sexualized with kind of uniformity to how they were portrayed on screen. Further, these portrayals were felt to isolate participants from the non-queer majority, and indeed some in the group questioned their social position as a result of having gone through all of these TV shows together in the group. Many group pondered whether such portrayals were positioned almost in a way to elicit this feel-good response from the non-queer white viewer, who through kind of the early conception of the project when we were looking at the data sets, kind of took on the assumption that kind of based on the population of the UK, most of these viewers would be non-queer white people, essentially. They felt that their identities in reality were negated in favor for this almost politicized, imagined identity, as they put it across, that have kind of surface level goals to their inclusion on screen. So those in the participant group felt that their own self-advocacy was hindered by these portrayals on screen, because this is what everyone is essentially watching and forming opinions on them and their bodies based on what they see, and that a level of consultation was required at the production level to ensure characters were more aligned to their lived experiences as marginalized people in this country. Interestingly, participants highlighted their own experience of violence and exclusion, felt that such portrayals negated their collective trauma in coming to their identity, coming to be comfortable in their own skin and where they live, essentially. And they presuppose that such portrayals, although being visibly seen through UK TV, made their real life experiences invisible to the general public. They've where the general public is informing what they understand through the screen rather than through the experience of people's lives, essentially. Finally, a majority of participants linked such, how they've defined it as kind of surface level portrayals, with how kind of queer resistance, such as pride, such as our advocacy, is becoming commercialized. as I believe, similar to what Ahmed mentioned earlier, this kind of commercialization of the queer experience, and kind of discussed how the evolution of how queer matters are portrayed on screen has led to now our inclusion serving more, a more commercial agenda, which causes more harm to these bodies in reality by way of being more visible to the general public, but not being visible at the same time, if that makes sense. And that is me. I've popped my references here on the screen because I haven't explained them too well in this presentation, I have to say. And at this point, I will leave it to questions.
Thank you, Krishan. For the sake of the Q&A, I'm going to move over to the group rather than have the group cooking it. So if anyone's still here, it's
Little round.
Can you hear it? Can you hear us okay?
Don't know yet. No one's speaking.
Great.
Right.
Speaking. Okay, I'm going to kick things off if that's all right. I particularly liked, I pulled a little quote out of your presentation right at the end there, Krishan, of the politicized imagined identity. I really love that as a descriptor for these characters, because we always have to remember that what we're seeing with these representations is just like a representation. It's just one representation as well, usually, because a lot of these characters are really isolated, especially in those soaps as well. Ahmed, like, you usually just have one character who is like archetypally emblematic of an identity, and then that explains the whole thing basically through their storyline. So it was interesting to me as well that the response, like the audience response to those episodes that you showed them, was so majority negative, really. And I was wondering if that was the case because there was such a limitation of story through, you know, a short-term amount of episodes versus the kind of overall positivity of these long-running soap representations. If you both want to weigh in on that kind of idea, there's some vague thoughts there.
Yeah, sure. So this is what's quite interesting when kind of doing the field work for this project, and it's tying into what I'm doing in my PhD, but looking at disability representation. I'm finding that, you know, by watching the episodes as a group, you know, people kind of become more comfortable with sharing their perspectives, as it were. And at first, we did kind of observe how participants were happy to have their inclusion on screen, but then those you know, as they started to take notes and kind of problematize the portrayals further, they couldn't necessarily see themselves within the characters. So whereas the non-queer majority are going, oh, you know, there's so many queer characters on screen, there's so many people of color on screen, you know, we don't have this many people in our country, sort of narrative. You know, that my participant base were saying, you know, it's great to have inclusion on screen and seeing so much of us on screen, but how realistic is those to our lives, and how does that position us in the mindset of those other people? Do they see us just taking our coupler off on screen? Taking their clothes off on screen? Do they just, you know, seeing us live these two-dimensional lives? And just yeah. Sorry, I don't know if I trailed off on the question a little bit there.
No, that made complete sense. That was great. Thank you. Yeah, same question, Ahmed. Any thoughts?
Sure. I am actually part of this discussion board. It's for mainly for the US soap operas, but there is an international soap opera breakdown where you can go and talk a little bit about EastEnders or Coronation Street, but they are typically the Canadians, not the British audience, who are writing. And I sometimes post on, you know, there are no queer representations at the moment about the about the American soaps, and people immediately say, well, we have Black people, as if they are all the same, all the diversity are the same. We have one category of diversity, we don't need all the other categories. And if there are some queer or trans characters, which are not that many at the moment, there's always a heavy criticism that the character is flawed. There are some issues with the character is bland. There is always some negative tone towards the character. And of course, these characters are not routinely being featured. So if they are disappeared, nobody wonders about them, or nobody questions where they are in the discussion board. They don't notice their absence. So I think even though there are here and there some pockets of diversity, the audience is not necessarily responding, I think, the way that we assume that they are. And maybe that is, at least in the case of the US soaps, it's it's still older crowd who are watching it, and they are typically more conservative compared to the millennials and the Gen Z, and maybe the soaps didn't do a well job to attract the younger generation. And I think that's a much better situation here in the UK at the moment, because I think there are still younger people who are tuning in, especially Hollyoaks is one of them. So there might be more positive responses to this character. But at least in the US, at least in the discussion boards that I am part of, the characters are misback received, and some of them are, like Krishan is saying, well, we have diversity, as if having one or two bodies is enough to cover the entire spectrum of diversity.
And it's that representation for representation's sake, it's
It's a check.
So true.
Got one of them, it's enough.
It looks like Christina's got a question, but I'll ask one while you're right. Just thinking as well, like looking at that chart that you showed us right at the beginning, Krishan. Yeah, plastic representation. Oh, that's a really good point. But yeah, just right at the start of your presentation, Krishan, you had a chart which was 2 bar charts. And
yes.
One of them had like trans characters less than 1% representation. And then as you were kind of laying out the history of soap representation in Ahmed, I was like, I wouldn't say it surprised me, but I'd almost forgotten that on Coronation Street, one of the most prominent trans representations on television long term was in the form of Hayley Cropper. And I was thinking, well, Hayley was such a long-lasting character, but overall there's such a lack of trans representation, and there's a lack of trans representation that isn't stereotypical for a great deal of kind of like television history as well. So with soaps, and maybe perhaps with other television and other forms, is there kind of, I would say more now, there might be the consideration that, oh, we can't do this yet because we haven't got an idea of how to present trans representation in a way that isn't stereotypical, because the form is so linear and trans journeys can be like so non-linear. Any thoughts on that one?
That's an excellent question. And, I'm stationed in the US, but I'm living in the UK this past year, and I realized how transphobic the UK have been, and how the characters, we've seen have received poorly because of their particular cultural issues that is surrounding it. And I also wanted to gently say this, we also have a transphobia in the queer culture. So therefore, it's not really helping that the transphobia is coming from, the mainstream is attacking it, but also there's a transphobia in the queer culture because of the gender is being fluid. We understand that, but, the regular people on the street might not really coping with that idea well, right? So therefore, I think we got issues about, one, the queer community itself is not really in peace with that, let alone the large community. And the representations that we see are trying to represent, but also to be careful not to overstep on any boundaries, because everybody's unique experience is framing the experience differently, right? So therefore, a black trans person's experience is going to be very different than somebody who is less marginalized in other areas of their identities. So what I'm trying to really get at, I think, one, we still don't know how to talk about as a queer community, let alone in a large community. So I think we are ourselves are failing to discuss this issue and educate people around it, let alone expect the media to do the job itself, which I think, as a public responsibility, they need to do that. But also we need to be on the same page, all of us, at least most of us, how to understand and how to embody and celebrate these diversities within the queer community.
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult because representations are so limited, but they demand so much at the same time.
Yeah, and also the other issue I think we're running into, Hayley Cooper was played by a straight woman, right?
Yeah.
I think she identified as a straight woman, if I am correct, if I'm remembering the interviews right. So there are trans actors who are not really hired to play these roles, right?
Yeah.
And there is also the question, are they the only roles that they can play? The answer is no. But when there are very few characters and there are actors out there who can play these roles, are not really cast into those roles, really begs the question of authenticity of these representations versus a checkmark. We have a trans character, yay, BBC have done a good job. Really, that shouldn't be the dilemma here. The other one I think to pay attention, I think ITV's Emmerdale with Maddie Barton's character is doing a little bit a better job at the moment, but still it's murky grounds. We don't really know how to write for the trans characters, let alone expect the audience to reflect to them in a particular way.
Yeah, that's why audience response research is so important, Krishan. Because audiences need to feedback and have their voices heard as well. And then that changes the game, I think, in terms of production.
Yeah.
Any questions from the room? Yeah.
Right. Can you hear me? I'm
Yes.
a bit further back from the room.
I think Mike is like on the ceiling.
Okay. She'll try to enunciate anyway. Okay, so thank you very much for two really interesting and fascinating papers. I potentially have questions for both of you. Maybe I'll start with Krishan, because I'm very interested in this issue of audience research. And I'm particularly curious about the case of Banana, because I'm not familiar with the other programs you mentioned, but Banana I sort of remember very well. And I'm kind of struck by how that seems to have gotten the negative reception, when my recollection of it is that it was created by Russell T Davies, so one of the sort of real kind of pioneers of queer representation on British television. And I think that one he basically tried to get. He wrote some episodes himself, and he also tried to get the sort of a new young generation of fresh queer talent to write the other episodes. So really, this shouldn't have been just the same as any old show that just kind of half-asses its kind of queer representation and makes the usual kind of blunders. This should have been better. So I'm kind of curious. I suppose I'm asking, can we consider this program a failure in its own terms? And maybe a sub-question to that, I'm interested in the fact that the objection people raised over and over again was the idea of kind of over-sexualization. And it seems to me, and I'm not really an expert here, but Russell T Davies's big kind of breakthrough in this area was Queer as Folk back in the late 90s. And that was striking at the time, because it sort of avoided the kind of coyness of representing gay men that you'd have in kind of soap operas and heritage dramas, and did actually kind of give them a much more sexualized treatment. And perhaps it was new and interesting to have that kind of on network television at the time. And perhaps what was exciting in 1999 has just become overdone and cliched, and maybe Russell T Davies is just kind of stuck in an old mode of doing things. But do you have any thoughts on that? Sorry, quite a lot.
Yeah, there is. I do apologise. Processing difficulties. So sometimes I'll get some of it, but I won't get all of the question there. So please do kind of. I'm going to start with the first bit, and please feel free to repeat boy. So when we, as a group, when we were looking at Banana, we focused mainly on the first 2 episodes. And what was quite, if I recall correctly, what was quite striking for the group was the representation of Dean. Mainly how within, I don't know if you recall, but within the first few scenes around Dean hooking up online and meeting this. If I can't remember how exactly they were placed, but it was almost like a key master who had vices for all of the young men that he was kind of getting on with, and that was the first kind of response that I was getting from the audience. And what we do in the project is we get all of the participants to write a reflection log as they're going through in the film. Now, I haven't, as I mentioned earlier, as part of the working paper, gone through all of the transcripts yet and picked out the points. Most of the points we picked out are through the second part of the focus group and the reflection logs. It could very well be, and this is one of the issues with audience research, is that the kind of shock through watching the screen is the stuff that ends up getting fed back. But we did see quite kind of early on through the films that participants were, very happy to see themselves on screen and seeing kind of queer ethnic characters being at the forefront of the shows. Initially, even the shows themselves were picked by the participant group. Through my process of field work is using a method called co-production, where I really kind of give over the project to the participants to inform the direction and evaluate how the project goes and its findings and outcomes. So I really kind of led the way to the participants to choose which shows that they wanted to see as a group and kind of talk through as a group. I before starting the project, I hadn't actually watched Banana up until the recommendation. I was like, okay, right, I'm watching for myself. And you're right, Banana is such a fascinating show, but kind of to my 17 new residents, they were more kind of struck in awe about the kind of sexualization of the character and how that almost was the main part of Dean's personality almost. And what was quite interesting coming through the Carney Film Club participants was that they were more eager to see how what was seen on screen, how it reflects on how other people may see them. So there was one participant in particular. It was I believe it was a Somali woman within her 30s who really kind of was on the narrative of how black men are seen, and for her in particular, if I recall correctly, that sexualization of black men was at the forefront of her thought process as she was kind of feeding her responses to us. So I think I feel like I've gone on a bit of a trail here, but which I'm so prone to do. Essentially, the way that with this type of research, you are at the mercy of your participants' understanding of the content, their own lived experience, thought process coming into it, and not just within queer black men seen on screen, but black men in general and in reality are over sexualized, and that was the kind of idea that she had coming into watching the films, and that's what she fed back to us. The good thing is we're meeting up for one last focus group after a month for participants to reflect, after they've had that time to reflect on what they've fed back and kind of give their conclusive thoughts. And I remain hopeful that I get kind of a bit more of a nuanced understanding that will really help me flesh out the paper more.
Thank you very much.
And did any of the participants want to see like the rest of the series? So
I placed some restraints within participants, mainly because of the booking for the hall that we had. So I essentially stated that you can pick three TV shows. We'll watch one or two episodes of those shows, but your main goal is to kind of go home, do your homework, watch, pick a show that you would like to watch as the group, and we'll focus on the main character portrayed in that show. So unfortunately, I was quite because of the kind of costs, as it were, I was very limited in which kind of shows that we brought forward. I had to say, 3 shows UK based, you find them, choose them, and we'll discuss them as a group.
That's great. That's a fantastic project. Any other questions in the room?
I'm just thinking, the over-sexualization of a queer community, don't you think is because of the character used in the film? Because most times there's somebody who does not belong to that group, and then they bring the person to come and act certain, the person might act over the board, giving poor representation to it. For instance, my younger brother is gay, and then the first movie ever produced in my country related to that, though it was later banned because my country is not friendly to queer community. We were watching it, and they were like, no, this can't be, because this is not how we behave. This is not how we act, and this is not is excessive. I think if a script writer, if you're producing a film and then you look for somebody who belongs to that community, the person should be able to portray that character very well. That's the second step. But in terms of writing a script of a movie, who is the person writing the script? That person needs to be questioned. What is his intent? Does he or she belong to the community and all that? Because that can actually cause poor representation as well. It is either overrepresented or underrepresented. So I think those kind of things should be also put into consideration. And my research focuses on audience, though not in your line of research, but I focus on audience research. I think that area should also be looked at. Who are the writers, or who are the script writers? Do they belong to this community? Who are the actors? Do they belong to these communities? But that can actually influence the representation and all that, based on what I've seen from my brother.
Yeah, Russell T Davis, James and Gay himself, wants to see more sex on screen, things like that. So yeah, that's an interesting point. I don't know much about the production of those instruments. And maybe you can fill us in.
So part of my my main thesis is actually looking at disability representation in Bollywood film industry, and one of the things that keeps coming back as I'm kind of interviewing those involved in production around how they go around kind of character development, how they inform the characters, because most, similar to as we're seeing with it, particularly within UK soaps, as Ahmet brought up, it's not done by queer actors. And one of the things that kind of keeps coming out of the early conversations was them essentially saying, if I could get hold of that demographic and and learn from them to help develop the script, then I would do it. As I'm going through for the main thesis, the fieldwork for Carney Film Club, looking at disability representation, I've had quite a lot of these professionals try to reach out to kind of use the project as a focus group for them, to help them inform the direction of the characters, because it's quite particularly important when it comes to disability representation, because we don't see those, how can I explain, the financial power of disabled people is huge. In the UK, it's 23% of the population, and if their inclusion isn't considered, then you're not making money from them. So where I'm trying to get at is that it's not, in my opinion, I don't think these production companies and those involved in the group don't want to reach out to those demographics and try to make the representation better. It's that it's access to communities, which is a tricky part. And there's also creative freedoms. We can, if I'm making a film, I have the direction to choose how I inform the character.
I know that you just focus on the audience, how they see the representation and all that. Okay, and So you just focus on audience and all that. But then this group need to tell their own story. And that is how to get accurate representation. You cannot tell my story and tell it accurately. You have to allow me to tell my story. In that way, I'll give good, put it in a proper perspective. You understand? So if the gay community, if the queer community is allowed to tell their story, they will tell it perfectly, give proper representation of who they are, than allowing people someone who does not belong to the community to tell the story, because the person might underrepresent or overrepresent. I think that is where the research is focused. Allow this group of people to tell their story and tell it accurately, because they might, just like the other person was saying, that the black kid that said they were underrepresented as being poor and all that. And the people from my home country, though they are hiding, they cannot come out and say we are gay. They are very, very rich. They own high and good businesses. They are very, very rich. But some of them, because of the kind of society where they are gays and all that, they just marry to just cover up who they are. But I know they are very, very rich. So if they are allowed to tell their story, they could tell it perfectly. We are not poor. We are not. It cannot be relegated to the background forever. People think. Allow us to tell our story. We are more than what you people think we are. So in that way, the perfect story will be made. I mean, perfect representation will be done, and yeah, and then people will understand this is not what gay is all about. This is what it is. So yeah, I think
There's some new power dynamic there.
Yeah.
Like, oh, we're extremely wealthy, so we're going to make a story which is about ourselves.
Yeah.
And it might be kind of a closed representation based on wealth.
Yeah.
So there's issues there.
Yeah.
Ahmed, with yours, I think really, you know, what you're saying at Potosi as well, it kind of shows where we're at with representations and kind of like the development of representations. The timeline that you gave us was really, really clear in how everything is developed kind of based on people being more able to tell their stories, because more queer writers, more trans writers as well, and advisors, I think you touched on briefly, like people coming to advise on like certain lived experiences.
Like it happened to third world country, because before they used to use these parachute journalists to come gather news about Africa. They just depended on war kind of journalism. And then people in the West who think that Africa is such a poor country full of bad news and all that. But then when this issue of BBC African Eye came in, so these people they allow they're kind of Africans who tell their own story. So they dig deep into an issue and understand the problem and give detailed explanation of why this is happening, than allowing a parachute that just go into the country and say, yeah, they're fighting and they're shooting, and then that's it, without digging deep. I think if it should be done that way, accurate representation will come than not like.
Yeah, I'm really interested by the use of the word like accurate and like authentic and realistic.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean? That's my question.
Well, yeah, it's very interesting that so Ahmed talked about the roots of Coronation Street and British soap opera in the new wave. We talk about kind of realism, and yet queer people are real,
yes.
and yet it takes 20 years to appear. But the interesting thing, given that we talked about kind of queer rights and stuff, Coronation Street was created by a gay man in 1960. So it's interesting that he didn't or couldn't, I don't know what, put gay characters in, and it took so long.
Maybe this is the kind of thing where it's like, well, I want to get this right. Somebody
maybe
sanitize.
Yeah.
He couldn't because there was the sodomy laws that still existed in the UK. So being gay was a punishable act that you would have been arrested for being gay. So therefore, if you look at the historiography of the queer representations in the UK, you will see I believe it's 1965 or 1966, the first film comes out. And then we see Sunday Bloody Sunday, which is the tail end of the realism in 1969 or 1970. So because of the laws, you couldn't have these characters for the most part. You could have coded them in a particular way. But again, it's like, who wants to play these roles, right? But also, if you look at the representations, I think we are finding ourselves in a dilemma here. If it's a soap or a television drama, that probably 90% of the characters are going to be straight or white, right? Unless you are gearing towards a queer show or a show that focuses on a Black experience. You're going to have very monolithic story and a lot of mainstream. And what is difficult though, let's say we have 5 Black characters in a show or 2 queer characters. Because there are so few of them, we expect all of those characters to do everything diverse. And they're not going to do that. They're going to fail to do that because as an audience, we are so hungry for differences in those characters and differences in those representations. We put lots of expectations and we fail. So maybe then if we can manage to diversify the writers who can create more diverse, complicated characters for us, we can expect that there are intersectionalities that are going to be there present rather than absent, right? So if you look at it, there are 3 queer characters in, let's say, EastEnders. They are at the moment for the most part white. Where are the Black queer characters? Where are the immigrant queer characters, right? We are banking on one particular prototype of a character as a queer character and kind of erasing, not representing the rest of them. So the question here is because, again, the queer culture can be racist and can be sexist or can be ableist, like what kind of room do we have when we have these characters to represent them with the older layers? And who is going to do just? Because they are going to be one character of a type. And how can we expect, right, that character to encapsulate all of the layers of all of those intersectionalities? So maybe there has to be room to create multiple characters. And I don't know how open the writers or the producers are going to be to diversify the shows in that matter, that there are more than just one of a type.
It's very true. Christina, do you have any questions?
No, I'm okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Just making sure everybody has a chance. Krishan, any thoughts on like authenticity, realism, these kind of things that came up in sort of both presentations?
No, sorry. I got so comfortable listening to Ahmet. It's just like almost I can never pronounce the word midolic. It's like music to my ears hearing you speak on it. Yeah, so it was quite interesting running these TV shows through the Carney Film Club with these 17 participants. Well, was this idea of authenticity of characters, and really, I think there is definitely room to showing less more than 2-dimensional representations of queer people on screen, and show that there's more to our experiences than just being queer, and that shouldn't always necessarily be the forefront of the plot around your character. But at the same, and a lot of the participants felt that because there wasn't any realism to the character or more dimensions to them, that it is almost erasing their realities, and that how can I explain, there was no authenticity to their to their experiences, so they couldn't relate to the characters, see themselves on screen. But then other people, the non-queer, mostly Caucasian majority are seeing them as them. So we may that it's to me, we're using film as a way to be seen, because we don't get that interaction with the wider populace, but the wider populace is interacting with these characters, and this is what they're informing from these shows. So I think, as tricky as it is to get, lived experiences of people seen through more through these character portrayals, it is important to try to gain that, quote unquote realism. Otherwise, the majority are making, opinions that they're informing from the TV, which spills into reality, and we see, particularly with the trans community in the UK, erosion of rights, because it's like, oh well, they're almost, for want of a better phrase, they're bloody everywhere, they're taking over sort of narrative. We only see these people on screen, but actually we're very, the trans community is a very, very, very small minority, even a minority within the wider queer communities, and there's a lot more violence that's put onto their bodies because they, people see difference. They don't, they see a very superficial view of them, and that's the way that they're seen and treated, and it feeds into that common discourse about people. So as much as it's great to have inclusion on screen, we do need the inclusion to be a bit more realistic, a bit more to to those lived experiences and realities of people.
Very actionable note to end on, I think. Thank you both so much. That was really fantastic. Great presentations and an amazing chat. Thank you for being here. We'll give you a little thumbs.
Thank you for sharing it. That's
Yes,
wonderful.
thank you.
Thanks, Christina. Bye.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone. Thank you for being such a receptive audience.
You're very welcome.
Well
Yeah.
done. Good job,
Yeah.
Krishan.
Ahmet, have we met before?
We did.
Mexa, right?
And Aberdeen.
Yeah, I thought as much.
We did.
When we met, when we met to do the earlier presentation, I was like, sure, I know him.
We were on a bus together.
Yes.
Rita
Yeah,
introduced
yes.
that. I like just
Yeah.
coming back.
Okay, yeah,
Okay. See
Yeah,
you at
as
the
you-
next lecture.
yeah. See you next Mexa, my friend.
Yeah.
Yeah, take care.
Bye.
And my master's dissertation was actually on non-binary horror audiences, and kind of how looking at kind of horror figures in transitions, and looking at the ghost and the vampire is kind of like between binaries of living and dead.
I know somebody's written about trans horror, like Frankenstein.
Yeah.
So you should send me an email.
I will do, yeah. But yeah, I just thought that was it's just really cool. So I thought it is.
Like, I'm not doing it, but
Yeah. So yeah.
it'd be fun. Yeah. I just think I'd be very rude.
Oh yeah, it's really fun.
Oh, thank you. I love your suit.
I am. Nothing important. Picture. I'm sure.
Should we do a quick little panel?
Yeah, it's fun, but
I actually love this, like, I wish this happened. That's all good.
one of the.
Like, oh, I was expecting.
To this image, it
I'm
has some
really
powerful one.
scared.